How to have fun anytime, anywhere. Step 1. Go to ChumbaCasino.com.
ChumbaCasino.com. Got it.
Step 2. Collect your welcome bonus.
Come to Papa welcome bonus.
Step 3. Play hundreds of casino-style games for free.
That's a lot of games. All for free?
Step 4. Unleash your excitement.
Woohoo!
Chumba Casino has been delivering thrills for over a decade. So claim your free welcome bonus now and live the Chumba life. Visit ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome to This Week Explained, the podcast that cuts through the noise to help you make sense of our ever-changing world. I'm Tiana, and each week, my co-host Kervin and I break down the biggest global events and explain what they mean for you. This week, we're diving into the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, Iran's heightened nuclear security, the potential dismantling of Africa Command, and the arrest of Romanian presidential candidate Kalyn Georgescu. Like we usually do, we're going to be starting off with the war in Ukraine, Europe's efforts to strengthen its defense, and Trump's controversial minerals deal with Ukraine that as of right now hasn't been signed because of what happened in the meeting between him and Zelensky. It's been 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it seems like the EU is finally waking up to the reality of its own security needs. So, what's going on? What's happening?
Well, yeah, look, Europe is at a crossroads, Tiana. The war in Ukraine has shattered this post-Cold War security order that they thought they had, and it's got European leaders realizing they cannot or can no longer rely on the United States as their primary security pillar. Former U.S. ambassador to NATO, that's Ivo Dalder, he put it very bluntly to European leaders. He said, Europe needs to wake up and prepare to defend itself because the U.S. might not always be there.
That's a pretty stark warning. What's driving this shift in thinking?
I mean, a few things. Well, first and foremost, is Donald Trump's presidency. His recent rhetoric have shaken Europe's kind of the confidence of Europe in the United States as a reliable ally. Trump has openly criticized NATO and even suggested that the U.S. might not come to Europe's aid in the future. Now, combine that with the ongoing war in Ukraine and Russia's aggressive posture, and you've kind of got a perfect storm forcing Europe to rethink its defense strategy.
So what is Europe doing about it?
Well, the EU is being pushed to significantly increase defense spending, and a recent report from a transatlantic task force recommends that European nations spend 3% of their GDP on defense. That's 1% above NATO's 2% minimum. But here's the problem. Many EU countries, just like some NATO countries, and we've talked about this before, but countries like Spain and Italy, they're struggling to even meet that 2% target.
So are there any concrete plans to address this?
Yeah, I think the European Commission is going to step in to help. They're kind of relaxing fiscal rules to allow member states to boost defense budgets. And then there's even talk of a defense version of the EU's COVID recovery fund. But there is resistance to this, and that's especially coming from Germany and then the Netherlands. They're both very wary about joint borrowing. Now, on top of that, there's no consensus on what Europe's defense priorities should be. For example, Europe is woefully unprepared for air and missile attacks. But there are 3 conflicting air defense proposals on the table. All of this is just a complete mess, Tiana.
Well, I mean, if the European countries are struggling to meet 2% GDP, I don't think they're going to, be too thrilled about the 3%.
Yeah, or even try to make it to 3%.
Yeah, I mean, if they can't make it to 2%, how are they going to make it to 3%?
Yeah.
Okay? That's not how math works. Sounds like, Europe has a long way to go, but for now, let's shift gears to the dramatic Oval Office meeting between President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. This has been all over my feed, obviously.
Yeah, me too.
This meeting, which was supposed to be about a U.S.-Ukraine agreement on critical minerals, turned into a heated exchange about the war in Ukraine and U.S. support for Kiev. And also, honestly, they were throwing around disrespect a whole lot. They were telling Ukraine that they needed to be grateful for what we've done for them. Tell us, what's going on here?
Yeah, look, the meeting was nothing short of explosive, and it's not just because of the shouting matches. I will say this. These shouting matches we find out about after the fact, right? Somebody's going to write a book, and they'll talk about the presidential meetings that he had with diplomats. And
what are you talking about? We find about it after. We found out about it during.
Right, that's what makes this one different, is that the media was there, and they were filming it live, and everyone got to see it. This isn't something that came out in a book 3 years later.
They're not going to be able to spin it one way or the other.
Right. So this is completely different, but it's the evolution of today's media, right? We're finding out about these things all the time. Now, it did start off on a polite note, but things went downhill very fast. That's when Zelensky pushed back against Vice President J.D. Vance and his suggestion that Ukraine should pursue a diplomatic solution with Vladimir Putin to end the war. Now, Zelensky didn't hold back. He laid out a detailed history of Russian aggression.
Don't bring your facts here.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I'm saying that.
Are you J.D. Vance?
Yeah, don't bring your facts here. That's disrespectful.
Look, Russia is the aggressor, and they have been towards Ukraine for over a decade now. The territorial seizures, broken ceasefires, failed prisoner exchanges, and then I'll tell you this, it did not sit well with Trump or Vance.
Right, and it seems like Trump didn't hold back either. What exactly did he say to Zelensky?
Well, he accused Zelensky of being, quote, disrespectful, end quote, and also ungrateful for the billions of dollars the U.S. Sent in military aid. That's since the war began in 2022. Now, at this point, at that particular point, he raised his voice and he told Zelensky, and I want to quote Trump here, and I don't do a Trump impersonation, so don't get ready for that.
Yeah, don't. It's not happening.
Not happening. But, quote, you're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III, end quote. He also emphasized that Ukraine is in a weak position and that the U.S. support is critical to its survival, even went as far as to basically say Ukraine is not going to be okay without U.S. support.
That is a very bold statement. It sounds like Vice President Vance also had some pointed remarks. So what role did he play in this exchange?
Yeah, I mean, he was very much aligned with Trump in this meeting because he didn't want to get fired in his second month in office. That's what happens if you disagree with President Trump. So he criticized Zelensky for not showing enough gratitude and even questioned whether Zelensky had said thank you for the U.S. aid.
So he wanted him to kiss the ring, basically.
Yes, that's exactly what this is.
He wasn't even in office whenever this kicked off.
Right.
But he wants
He wants the accolades.
Yeah.
The way that I told Mike Leon and I were texting about this, and I told him it was a very narcissistic behavior that was coming out in here, and it was, he basically Trump wanted Zelensky to say Trump is the greatest, he's this great negotiator, and he, negotiated this peace deal and won the war for Ukraine, and that Biden was some buffoon that didn't know what he was doing. That's what Trump really wanted.
Right.
Now, Vance also brought up that Zelensky made a visit to Pennsylvania during the presidential elections. There was an ammunition plant, very famous, with Governor Josh Shapiro, if everybody remembers when that happened. Now, Republicans interpreted that as a campaign stop in support of the Biden administration, and he accused Zelensky of essentially campaigning for the opposition and demanded that he show more appreciation for U.S. efforts.
Well, it seems like the underlying tension here is about the U.S. role in the war and whether Ukraine is doing enough to acknowledge that support. But Zelensky didn't back down, did he?
No, Zelensky pushed back hard. He suggested that the U.S. doesn't yet feel the full ramifications of the war, and that's because of U.S. geographic distance. We're a full ocean away from this. But Zelensky did say that the U.S. will feel it in the future, and that comment sent Trump off. He said, quote, don't tell us what we're going to feel, because you're in no position to dictate that, end quote. Now, Zelensky also made it clear that Ukraine has been fighting for its survival against a much larger aggressor, and that diplomacy with Putin isn't a simple solution, given Russia's history of breaking agreements.
So this meeting was supposed to be about a critical minerals agreement. And so how did that factor into the discussion?
That deal was meant to boost Ukraine's economy and then help the U.S. recoup some of the money that it had provided to Ukraine. Now, that topic was completely overshadowed by the heated back and forth over the war. By the end of the meeting, Trump posted on Truth Social that Zelensky was, quote, not ready for peace, end quote, and he suggested he was cutting off talks with the Ukrainian leader. Now remember, Trump hyperbole is still a thing here. We got to wait and see how all of this plays out over the next few days. Trump's going to want some apologies. He's going to want gratitude, and that's going to make him feel a lot better. But we're going to see if Zelensky actually capitulates to that.
So where does this leave U.S.-Ukraine relations?
Yeah, it's not looking great. And Trump's not wrong when he says the U.S. has been a critical lifeline for Ukraine.
That's true, but he wasn't part of that.
That's what I want to very clear. That was a different administration.
Yeah, and he talks crap about that administration constantly.
Exactly.
So why would he want the accolades for that,
He should want the accolades for what he's doing right now, for this agreement.
Well, he does. He wants it for everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, as everyone can tell, Trump's approach is way more aggressive than Biden's approach. Now, for Ukraine, the stakes couldn't be any higher. They are literally fighting for their survival. So how this dynamic plays out is going to come down to these two leaders, each of which are convinced they are acting in the best interests of their own countries.
All right, well, for now, we'll have to table this discussion, and we'll get back to it next week after everybody's tempers have calmed down a little bit.
We hope.
We'll see. Maybe they'll make a better decision with clear heads.
Yeah.
Maybe. We'll see. But now I want to shift our focus and get into the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, which has been holding for 6 weeks, but now it's at a critical juncture. I feel like there's a critical juncture every week. There's always the possibility it, crumbles. There's so much to cover, from the recent hostage exchanges to the other implications of this conflict. So we're going to need you to give us a quick overview of where things are standing right now.
Yeah, we've discussed this plenty of times. The original ceasefire, that was part of this hard-fought, hard-won agreement between Israel and Hamas. It has been in question, just like your astute point that you've made, since before the ink even dried. We do talk about it every week, that it's on the brink of collapse. Now, the first phase of the deal is set to expire when this episode comes out on Saturday. And while it has brought some temporary relief, the situation remains incredibly precarious. Now, just this week, Hamas handed over the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages, and in return, Israel released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. This was the final swap under the first phase of the ceasefire.
Well, what is next for this ceasefire? Is there any hope for the second phase of the deal? Do you think they're going to be able to meet those expectations?
$1 million question, I would say. The second phase is supposed to involve the release of all remaining Israeli hostages, also Israel's withdrawal from Gaza, and a permanent end to the war. But right now, the two sides are far from reaching an agreement. Hamas said it's open to talks, but they refuse to disarm. That's a key demand from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, on the other hand, Netanyahu is under immense pressure from his far-right coalition partners, who have vowed to bring down his government if he doesn't completely destroy Hamas as a political and military force in Gaza.
Well, that's what he said he was going to do from the start.
That's true.
Well, it looks like, as of right now, both sides are stuck in a political and strategic deadlock. So what are the chances that this truce could collapse?
Yeah, it's probable. Chances are highly likely. Both Netanyahu and Hamas are facing conflicting pressures. For Netanyahu, ending the war without disarming Hamas is going to be seen as a failure. He is going to get pushed out. They're already pushing for expanded military operations in the region. Now, for Hamas, giving up its weapons would contradict its core mission of armed resistance against Israel. This deadlock makes the second phase agreement far more difficult than the actual first agreement. And if no deal is reached, there will be a resumption of the war in Gaza. That's almost inevitable.
That's a pretty grim outlook. So there's also been some international involvement here, right? Like, what role is the U.S. playing in all of this besides that ridiculous AI video?
Trump Gaza.
That
Goodness.
he released. I was
Use AI for good, people.
He thinks that's good.
That's true. You're right.
That's great.
You got me on that one. Look, the U.S. has been involved in the situation with a ton of controversy. So, you talked about the AI video. You might also remember that President Trump recently floated the proposal of removing Palestinians from Gaza and having the U.S. take control of the territory. Now, that idea was widely dismissed as unrealistic, but it did have an effect. It pushed Arab states to start working on alternative plans for rebuilding Gaza and then establishing new leadership in the region. Meanwhile, Trump's special envoy, that's Steve Witkoff, he's been advocating for an extension of the current truce. Interestingly enough, both Hamas and Israeli officials have shown some willingness to consider that extension, but let's be clear. Extending the ceasefire, that's just a temporary fix. It doesn't stop the war completely, and it doesn't tackle the deeper, more complex issues at play, like the disarmament of Hamas or the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and it also doesn't solve Israel's own security problems. These are the challenges that are going to need real solutions, not just these stopgap measures.
And while both sides bicker back and forth, we have Gazans and Israeli citizens living in fear on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk about public opinion, the people actually being affected by this. How are Israelis and Palestinians reacting to this back and forth?
Well, look, in Israel, there's strong public support for moving to the second phase of the deal. They want it to stop. A recent poll showed that 70% of Israelis want the government to secure the release of all hostages and just end this war. Now, many Israelis are calling on Netanyahu to prioritize the hostages' return, even if it means making compromises with Hamas. Now, in Gaza, there's growing frustration among Palestinians that the ceasefire hasn't brought the promised improvements in living conditions. People are desperate for reconstruction. They're desperate for just their basic necessities. Those efforts have been slowed to materialize.
Well, it's clear that this conflict is at a critical turning point. So before we wrap up discussing this, what should we be watching for in the coming weeks?
That's a great question. We first, obviously, got to keep an eye on the ceasefire. If it gets renewed, that's great. But I want to know what the terms of that renewal looks like. Any changes in the guidelines, that could signal shifts in the broader strategy. Now, second, it's crucial to watch how the Arab states respond as the pressure really mounts on them to align more closely with Israel. This includes where they take harsher stances against the Iranian proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah. Now, their actions in the coming weeks, I'm really interested in because they could significantly shape the next phase of this conflict.
Well, we will obviously need to keep a close eye on how things develop in the coming week. But up next, we're turning our attention to escalating tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States. But before we dive in, we're taking a quick break for a message from our sponsors. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome back, listeners. As we hinted earlier, we are discussing the escalating tensions between Iran, Israel, and the United States. There's been a flurry of activity recently, and it's raising questions about whether we're on the brink of a major conflict. So let's start with the basics, like we're prone to do. What is going on with Iran's nuclear program, and why is it such a flashpoint?
Yeah, look, Iran's nuclear program has been a contentious issue for decades now. Tehran insists that its program is for peaceful purposes. They say it's for energy production, medical research, but Israel and the United States have long accused Iran of pursuing nuclear weapons capabilities. That is seen as a direct threat to regional and global security. Now, this has led to years of sanctions, years of covert operations, and even cyber attacks aimed at slowing Iran's progress. Now, what we're seeing is a significant escalation. Iran has placed its defense systems around its nuclear sites on high alert, and that signals it believes an attack by Israel or the United States could be imminent. This comes after a series of high-level meetings between the U.S. and Israeli officials, including a secretive session with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his administration.
Well, that is a lot to unpack, so let's start with Iran's decision to heighten its defenses. So what does that tell us about their mindset right now?
Well, it tells us they're taking the threat seriously. By elevating their alert status, Tehran is signaling that it's ready to respond to any potential strikes. It's a classic deterrence strategy. They're saying, if you attack us, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be cost-free. Now, there is a flip side to this. By mobilizing its defenses, Iran risks exposing the locations and capabilities of its air defense systems. And this could give Israel and the United States valuable intelligence to exploit in the event of an actual attack happening.
Well, speaking of Israel and the U.S., there's been a lot of speculation about their intentions. We know the U.S. CENTCOM chief made an unpublicized visit to Israel recently. So what is the significance of that?
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. CENTCOM, as you said, that's United States Central Command. They oversee American military operations in the Middle East. If you think Iraq and Afghanistan, CENTCOM had control over that global war effort for the entire war. Now, for the CENTCOM chief, that is General Kurilla the Guerrilla. I knew him as Colonel Guerrilla, or Kurilla.
What?
Colonel Kurilla. He was in Balad. So when I was in Kirkuk in Iraq and I was coming back home, he was in Balad, and he actually helped me get my new ID so I could get out of Balad. He's a great guy.
Why couldn't you get your ID?
The ID card systems were down, and no one was trying to help out, and they were like, well, you're just going to have to be here till the systems are fixed.
How long did it take for the systems to get fixed?
Well, we went around Balad for about 18 hours, driving around trying to find the one ID shop.
Which deployment was this?
That was my first deployment from Bragg.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, so we went all around. He's a great guy.
Nice.
As far as I know.
Yeah.
I mean,
he helped you
in
your moment of need.
He's helped me in my time. Now, he's out in Israel. He's meeting with Netanyahu, as well as other senior defense officials. And to me, that suggests that something significant is being planned. It could be anything from intelligence sharing or joint military exercises, or even discussions about a coordinated strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. See where we're going here? Now, the secrecy surrounding the visit only adds to the speculation. And it's clear that both the U.S. and Israel are taking the situation with Iran very seriously. They're likely exploring all of their options, whether that's diplomatic pressure or military action.
And then there's the classified Israeli sessions that are supposedly focused on Iran. So what do you make of those?
Right. So those sessions, I think, are a strong signal that Israel's actively gearing up for something, and it's something significant. So when you combine, I work on data points. It's not just one piece of information, right? We combine them all, and then we formulate an assessment. So when you combine that with the CENTCOM visit, with the discussions with the U.S., it paints a picture of a government that's laser-focused on Iran. Now, whether that means a military strike is imminent or they're just simply preparing for all contingencies, it's clear Israel sees this as a critical moment in history. It's also the fact that these sessions are classified, and that tells us they're likely discussing sensitive operational details, right?
Good thing you're talking about it.
Right. Well, the fact that they're meeting is public, so we'll say that.
Okay.
They want it to be public.
Because they want to kind of get under Iran's skin?
Yeah, Israel's known for its use of psychological operations.
Okay.
Sort of keep its adversaries off balance. So, by publicizing that these sessions are happening.
But not what the topic is.
But not what the topic is. Just, hey, we're just having these topics. We're talking.
Just hanging out, having a little short board. Relax.
Yeah. So, by letting that slip, they could be trying to bait Iran into revealing more about its nuclear program, or even its defense strategies. So, this is a classic move in the intelligence playbook. You create uncertainty, and you force your opponent to make the first move.
Okay, so let's step back for a moment. What is the bigger strategy here? You gave us multiple options. So what is your actual assessment? Is this about preparing for an actual attack, or is it more about intelligence gathering and psychological pressure?
You ready for this?
No. Don't do it. Please don't do it. No. No.
It's likely two things are true at the same time.
Okay, I'll give you that one because it's been a while since you used that. It's been a while.
But in this case, it's very true.
Right.
So the heightened activity is probably linked to preparations for a targeted military strike. That's probable. If Israel and the U.S. believe that Iran is close to developing a nuclear weapon, they may feel the time is running out to act. Now, on the other hand, the slow release of information about these meetings and sessions could be a deliberate tactic to test Iran's response. By creating uncertainty, Israel and the U.S. might be trying to provoke Iran into revealing the locations of previously unknown nuclear facilities or overextending its defenses, and then Israel will attack. This would give them a clearer picture of Iran's capabilities and their vulnerabilities.
Okay, well, that makes sense, I guess. But what are the risks here? If this escalates into a conflict, what could the fallout look like?
Well, look, the risks are enormous. A military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities could trigger a much broader conflict in the Middle East. Now, Iran would almost certainly retaliate. It's either going to be directly against Israel or through its proxies. They could try Hezbollah. They've kind of been dismantled. Maybe Hamas. I'm wondering what the Houthis are doing right now. Haven't heard too much from the Houthis in Yemen. Mm-hmm. So they could be gearing up for something big as Iran keeps funding them. The other aspect to this is not just about Israel. U.S. forces in the region would become targets. That's also true for Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Now, beyond the immediate military consequences, there's potential for economic fallout. A conflict in the Middle East could disrupt global energy markets, it could drive up oil prices, and then create economic instability across the world. And then we have the risk of miscalculation. That would be where a limited strike spirals into a full-scale war no one intended to happen, and then we're back to Trump's comments on World War III.
Well, that sounds like a very delicate situation indeed. So for now, let's shift to the African continent. The Trump administration is reportedly considering dismantling U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, and downgrading it to a subordinate command under U.S. European Command, or EUCOM. So let's start with the basics here. What exactly is AFRICOM, and why is it so important?
Yeah, look, AFRICOM is the U.S. military's regional command responsible for operations across the African continent. Have you looked at a map? Africa is a large continent. That command was established in 2007. That's to address the unique security challenges in Africa. We're talking counterterrorism, peacekeeping, but also building partnerships with other African nations. Now, for me, its importance lies in its focus on combating extremist groups like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and also ISIS affiliates on the continent. It's also countering the growing influence of global powers like China and Russia in Africa. Now, AFRICOM plays a critical role in maintaining stability and also advancing U.S. strategic interests on the continent.
So what's driving this push to downgrade AFRICOM?
Doge? No. Well, yeah, Doge, but Doge is part of it.
Okay.
Doge, DOD. So the Trump administration is looking to reduce military spending, and they think dismantling AFRICOM is a cost-saving measure.
Oh, great.
So the idea would be fold AFRICOM into EUCOM, so Africa Command into Europe Command. EUCOM already oversees operations in Europe and actually parts of the Middle East as well. Now, the argument is that AFRICOM's headquarters is already based in Stuttgart, Germany. That's in Europe. So it could theoretically operate as a subcommand under EUCOM because of this. Now, but this move would significantly reduce AFRICOM's autonomy and its ability to focus on Africa-specific challenges.
And it would spread everybody really thin.
It would. And it's already spread thin. I mean, This is the number one problem across the board in the DoD within AFRICOM is that it's spread too thin.
Mhm.
They don't have the resources. They don't have the search and rescue. They don't have the ability to move forces because it's so large.
Okay, so what would this mean for U.S. influence in Africa?
Well, look, if AFRICOM is downgraded, it's going to signal a major U.S. withdrawal from Africa. That's both militarily and also strategically.
So it's going to let Russia and China just run rampant.
Absolutely. And you know this is something that I was opposed to, especially during the Biden administration.
Right.
I think it was an abject failure. It allowed Russia unfettered access to the Western Sahel. It's now creating a power vacuum that China and Russia are more than ready to fill. China, for example, they've been expanding their economic and military presence in Africa for years. It already operates a military base in Djibouti, just a few miles from the U.S. military base that's in Djibouti, and they have plans for additional installations across the continent. Meanwhile, Russia, as we know, has established the African Corps within its own armed forces. They've gained a foothold in the Sahel region. They were really good getting into the information sphere and kicking out French troops.
Let's talk about China and Russia in more detail. So how are they positioning themselves in Africa, and what are their individual goals?
Look, they both see Africa as a critical battleground for influence. Now, China's approach is actually just economic. They're gaining influence on the continent to extract rare earth minerals because they need that to surpass the U.S. in technology creation. Now, this gives Beijing significant leverage over African governments, and it's now using that to now expand its military footprint. I talked about the base in Djibouti. That's just the beginning. They're also looking to establish more bases because they want to secure its trade routes. They want to project power globally. Now, you got Russia, on the other hand. They're doing the military-focused approach. They're using those private military contractors like they did with the Wagner Group. They want to build relationships, they say, with African governments. They want to provide security services. It's not really what they're doing. In the Western Sahel region, for example, Russia stepped in to fill the void after they pretty much forced France to withdraw. And they're gaining influence in countries like Mali and Burkina Faso.
And what about the whole counterterrorism aspect? How would downgrading AFRICOM impact efforts to combat extremist groups in Africa?
I mean, you know, that's one of my major concerns. AFRICOM's been instrumental in counterterrorism operations across the continent. Now, I work closely with African partners to combat groups like Al-Shabaab, which is in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, but also ISIS affiliates across the Western Sahel. Now, if AFRICOM is downgraded, those efforts are going to be for naught. EUCOM's already stretched thin because they're dealing with Russian aggression in Europe, so it's unlikely to give African operations or AFRICOM operations the attention that it needs. Now, this could allow extremist groups to regroup. Those groups can then expand, and it creates new security threats, not just for Africa, but for the United States and its allies.
Okay, well, what about Europe? How would this move impact EUCOM, which would have to take over AFRICOM's responsibilities?
Yeah, look, they're already heavily focused on countering Russian aggression in Europe. That's because of the war in Ukraine. Adding African operations to its plate, that's going to stretch its resources even further. It's going to potentially reduce its effectiveness, actually in both regions. Now, Europe has become a much more active theater in recent years. EUCOM's priorities are firmly rooted in defending NATO allies and deterring Russia. If it's forced to take on AFRICOM's responsibilities, it could lead to operational overstretch and a diminished focus on Africa.
Okay, so what is the alternative? How can the U.S. maintain its presence in Africa without overextending itself?
Look, I think the best approach is to keep AFRICOM as an independent command. Now, that said, and remember, this is what Trump said. This isn't what's happening right now, but it does cause some concern. Now, I do think the U.S. should focus on investing in multilateral efforts. That'd be working alongside European allies, then the African Union, and other regional organizations so they can share the responsibility for security and development across the continent. But before any of that can happen, I think the United States needs to address the current information sphere. Right now, it's being weaponized to push for the removal of French and U.S. forces. British forces are going to be next on the chopping block. You're going to start seeing more colonialization. The UK needs to get out. And you can believe that's right or wrong. We both talk about colonialization and the impacts that that's had on the African continent.
Right.
But the truth of the matter is the continent is struggling with extremism. And Western forces are really good because they've spent the last 20 years fighting extremism. So they're really good about rooting that out. No. Let's be clear. We are not dealing with benevolent actors here who are just simply they're looking out for Africa's best interests. I'm talking about Russia and China in this aspect. They are aggressive players. They're exploiting disinformation to gain access to resources, and that's with zero regard for the people who live there.
Yeah, they don't care about the African people. It's about getting what they can out of it. Okay, so now I want to shift focus back to Europe and get into the arrest of far-right populist Kalyn Georgescu, a man who came from out of nowhere to win the first round of Romania's presidential election last year. He's now facing serious criminal charges, and the situation has sparked protests and international criticism and even accusations of foreign interference, because that's what we all do. Now everybody says every single election is influenced by foreign actors. So let's start with the basics. Who is Kalyn Georgescu, and why is he such a controversial figure?
Yeah, look, this is probably going to be a bit of a polarizing discussion, depending on where listeners stand politically. That's because Kalyn Georgescu is a far-right populist candidate, and he gained significant traction in Romania's political landscape last year. Basically what you said, he came out of nowhere. He's known for nationalist rhetoric. He's openly praised Romania's fascist leaders from the 20th century. He's called them heroes. That alone made him a polarizing figure. But what really set off alarm bells was his apparent pro-Russian stance. While he's denied being Moscow's man, which is what some people in Romania are calling him, he did refer to Vladimir Putin as a, quote, patriot and leader, end quote, though he does claim he's not a fan. I want to get that out there. I will say that this kind of rhetoric, combined with his rapid rise in popularity, has made him a lightning rod for controversy, both domestically in Romania, but also internationally.
But now he's been arrested. So what charges is he facing, and how serious are they?
Well, they are very serious. Prosecutors have accused him of attempted incitement against the constitutional order.
Is it because of his opinions?
There's a lot of things that go into this. And it's whether you believe what the current Romanian government is saying, or you believe what Kalyn Georgescu is saying.
Right.
Now, the Romanian government says that he's been forming organizations with fascists, with racists. He's xenophobic, and he has some anti-Semitic characteristics.
Sounds like he sucks.
Yeah, and in Romania, they're not minor allegations. I know this is something on Twitter or X or social media we say all the time, not we, but people will throw those words out all the time to people. You're anti-Semitic, you're xenophobic, you're this, you're that. These are direct laws in Romania that you are not allowed to form governments with fascists and racists and xenophobes. So that's where this all comes in.
Okay.
And if he's convicted, these charges are going to derail his presidential ambitions, and it's also going to lead to significant legal consequences.
But here's where things get tricky, Kervin. Critics, especially those on the right, are saying that this looks like election meddling, and they're comparing it to how the West accuses Russia of interfering in elections. But now it's Europe and Romania's own government that seems to be influencing the outcome. So what is your take on that possibility?
Like, it's a valid point. It's one of the reasons this story is so polarizing. So from the perspective of Georgescu's supporters, as well as many on the global right, this looks like a heavy-handed attempt to sideline a candidate who was gaining a ton of momentum. The optics here are terrible. The optics in the U.S. are terrible. Because, as we know with the MAGA movement, this has drawn a lot of parallels, as you can understand. Mm-hmm. Arresting a president, trying to put him in jail.
Right.
So, tons of parallels with Donald Trump's legal troubles. The narrative there was that Trump was being prosecuted not for actual violations of the law, but to prevent him from running for president once again.
And it didn't work.
And it didn't work. It actually did the opposite of what they wanted it to do.
Freaking.
It emboldened him,
Right.
and it emboldened voters to come out and vote for him. Now, Georgescu's arrest feeds into that same narrative. The establishment is using legal and institutional abilities to suppress political opposition.
And it's not just the optics, right? There's also the question of whether this approach is effective. Like, could Romania have handled this differently?
Absolutely. I think Romania missed an opportunity here. Instead of arresting Georgescu and fueling claims of persecution,
Right.
they could have focused on countering his rhetoric and exposing his ties, if they exist,
Right.
through a more transparent and public information campaign. So by taking control of the narrative, engaging with the public, you can then undermine populist or extremist candidates, and you don't have to resort to measures that look like suppression. Unfortunately here, Romania's approach has only deepened divisions. It's given Georgescu's supporters more ammunition to claim he's the one that's being unfairly targeted.
I mean, if there aren't any ties to expose, then...
So if you want to get in just real quick to what the confusion around this is, so Georgescu a year ago was not seen as a political candidate. Not many people knew who he was. And then all of a sudden, as the election's coming, he utilized TikTok to rise to fame.
Dang TikTok, man.
And there's a lot of campaign finance problems with him getting support and money through TikTok. Foreign influence, through financial and campaign funding on the application. And we've got the whole China issue, right? We talk about TikTok and China's influence on Western operations because of that. So that's what this all revolves around. Is it legitimate support, or was he using the platform with the help of Russia and China to become the president of Romania? And with that comes implications.
Okay.
It's the implications, Mac.
Okay, so Romania is a key NATO and EU member. So how does this political turmoil affect its standing on the international stage?
Look, their position is as a vital part of NATO's eastern flank, and it makes this situation even more concerning. Now, the country is already under pressure because of its proximity to Russia. With the ongoing war in Ukraine, political instability, especially involving a figure like Georgescu, who's been accused of being pro-Russian, could weaken Romania's ability to project stability and reliability within NATO, but also the European Union. At the same time, the perception that Romania is suppressing political opposition could undermine its credibility as a democratic state.
Okay, well, before we wrap up, what is next for Georgescu? Could this situation escalate further?
Like, his immediate future is uncertain. There's protests going on. He's been placed under judicial control. He's barred from leaving Romania, and that complicates his presidential campaign. His candidacy may be decided by the Constitutional Court. They've previously barred far-right candidates from running. Now, if the court rules against him, it could lead to further unrest among his supporters. Now, on the international front, Romania is going to need to navigate the fallout carefully. This is especially true given the accusations of Russian interference and the scrutiny from its NATO and EU allies. So, we're talking about it now, but this story is far from over.
Well, it sounds like Romania is at a crossroads both politically and geopolitically. So, as always, Kervin, thank you for all of your insights. Is there anything else you would like to discuss?
Well, you're welcome, Tiana. And typically I would say I don't have anything else because we've gone about an hour and a half on the episode and we're both ready to eat and get out of the studio. But we do have some major news that we've been teasing out a bit to friends and family. And that is that Tiana can no longer say thank you for listening to this tiny little independent geopolitical podcast.
You said that wrong. I've been saying that for 3 years now, and you still haven't even gotten it right. That's why I say it.
That's why well, you've had tons of experience saying that.
Yeah.
But we had a couple discussions
Spit it out.
with Mike Leon over at Leon Media Network, and we have decided, they have decided to bring our podcast onto the network.
Woohoo!
We are, first of all, we're incredibly grateful.
We're big boys now.
Yes. Leon Media Network is it's a legitimate network. And I want to say thank you to Unfiltered Studios doing what they did to get us out there, to increase our audience and our visibility a little bit. But now we're moving on to Leon Media Network. And so you're going to see some changes. First of all, not in this artwork, but the next cover art for the next podcast, you should see a difference in what the cover art looks like. You'll see the Leon Media Network. We also have an affiliate, meaning we're going to be plugging some coffee. And you don't hear that on this episode. You will hear it on the next episode as we get the ad for it. Yeah, this whole transition process. You'll also see me on different news organizations now as we try to get the word out on geopolitical events from an intelligence perspective.
Right. And a ding-dong perspective.
A ding-dong perspective. That's also my perspective sometimes.
That's me. That's me. I guess I should have said civilian or like layperson or, any other word that's not talking crap about myself, but you know me.
I do, yeah. So yeah, big things. So
exciting things.
Very excited about this. So yeah, nothing's going to change as far as the information that we put out. I did have Mike and I had a conversation, and it was clear that he's not looking to change how we put the podcast out or what we say on the podcast. He's just looking to support us. And we have always said any network that comes and they try to change what we're saying or try to change the information that we're putting out, we're not going to go with. So you're going to hear the same information.
Mike would never.
No. And he listens and he enjoys the podcast as well. So he sees that we put out the proper information, good information, factual information, I would say.
But also tinged with our opinions occasionally.
Yeah, and we'll say it. We'll tell you. Like last week. If you remember last week, it was very opinionated. It had tons of opinions.
Well,
and you don't have to agree with them.
We're allowed to have them.
I'm telling that to Tiana, too. You don't have to agree with them. They're my opinions. They are facts, and I can't prove them, but I believe them.
But I believe them.
Put that on a shirt. So, yeah. Yeah, we're very excited.
That was Tucker Carlson.
That was Tucker Carlson.
Okay, yeah. All right, well, I think we can wrap it up now, right?
Yeah, I think so. That's it.
Okay, well, thank you so much for listening to This Week Explained. We hope you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. For more in-depth coverage of these stories and beyond, be sure to follow us on social media at This Week Explained.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.
How to have fun anytime, anywhere. Step 1. Go to ChumbaCasino.com.
ChumbaCasino.com. Got it.
Step 2. Collect your welcome bonus.
Come to Papa Welcome Bonus.
Step 3. Play hundreds of casino-style games for free.
That's a lot of games. All for free?
Step 4. Unleash your excitement.
Woohoo!
Chumba Casino has been delivering thrills for over a decade. So claim your free welcome bonus now and live the Chumba life. Visit ChumbaCasino.com.